Here is your part one in simple English, written in a natural and engaging human tone. Without headings and without restricted names, the hall smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors. The kind of smell that reminded people of school assemblies and forgotten local events. The seats were almost full, mostly families, a few curious neighbors, and some students who had come to cheer for their friends. But the atmosphere inside the art center changed the moment the well-known film director walked in. People whispered when they saw him, surprised he had agreed to judge a small-town youth showcase. His reputation for being brutally honest had traveled far, and many wondered if the young performers were ready for the kind of sharp comments he was known for. He walked with a confidence that filled the whole room, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a cup of coffee that looked too expensive for the tiny town. His eyes moved around slowly, scanning every corner as if he had stepped into a museum of forgotten things. A few parents nudged their children to sit straighter, while others whispered about how this man had judged big competitions in major cities. His presence alone made the hall feel smaller. Then his gaze landed on the piano that stood at the corner of the stage, like a forgotten piece of furniture. Its paint chipped on one side, and its legs uneven, as if someone had tried to fix them hurriedly. A thin layer of scratches covered the surface, and the keys had lost their shine long ago. It was the kind of piano that most people walked past without noticing, but the director noticed, and not kindly. He stopped walking, took a slow sip of his coffee, and raised his eyebrows with an exaggerated expression. The room grew quieter, as if everyone sensed something was about to happen. He tapped the piano lightly with his fingertip and stepped back, shaking his head. "You call that a piano?" he said loudly enough for half the hall to hear. A few people laughed nervously, the kind of laugh people make when they're not sure if they should disagree or pretend they found it funny too. The young performers sitting in the front row exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some lowered their eyes, feeling embarrassed even though they had nothing to do with the piano. One of the event volunteers tried to step in, explaining that the town had limited funds and the piano had been donated many years ago. But the director barely listened. He kept staring at the instrument as if it personally offended him. "I've seen props on movie sets that look more real than this," he muttered. "It looks like it belongs in a storage room, not on a stage." His voice carried easily across the hall, and parents shifted uneasily in their seats. No one knew how to respond. People respected his talent, but moments like this reminded them why his reputation for being harsh was not exaggerated. The performers, most of them teenagers, sat quietly. A few whispered among themselves, wondering who would be unlucky enough to play that piano today. Some of them had practiced for weeks, waking up early or staying late after school just to prepare for this event. But hearing the director mock the instrument they were supposed to perform on made their confidence shrink quickly. One boy, sitting in the second row, kept his head slightly lowered as he listened. He already knew the piano wasn't impressive. It wasn't new or shiny. But he also knew things about it that no one else in the room did, things the director wouldn't understand by just looking at it from the outside. Still, hearing those loud comments stung more than he expected. The event coordinator stepped onto the stage to begin the showcase, trying to lighten the mood. She spoke with a cheerful voice, thanking everyone for attending and reminding them that the purpose of the event was to encourage the young musicians. But even she couldn't completely hide the nervousness in her voice. The director sat back in his chair, crossing his arms. He looked around again, almost as if silently daring the performers to impress him despite the old piano. The spotlights shone on the stage, making the scratches on the wooden frame look even more obvious. It wasn't a grand piano. It wasn't even a good upright one. It was simply a piano the town had managed to keep alive over the years. People in the audience whispered quietly. Some whispered about the director's comment, others about the piano's condition. One parent whispered that maybe the event should have rented a better instrument, but another replied that the budget couldn't even cover the lighting upgrades the center needed. Meanwhile, the performers lined up backstage for their turn. Their expressions showed everything: anxiety, excitement, fear, hope, all mixed into one. Every performer had a different dream. Some wanted to impress their families. Some wanted to win a small prize. And some simply wanted to share something they loved with the world. And then there was the boy, the quiet one sitting in the second row. He stood up slowly when his turn approached. His heart beat faster, not because he feared the piano itself, but because he knew everyone's eyes would be on him the moment he walked onto the stage. The director had already set a heavy tone by mocking the one instrument he was about to play. It felt like climbing a mountain with people waiting below, unsure if he would fall or make it to the top. He took a deep breath and walked toward the side of the stage. The other performers watched him with mixed emotions. Some felt relieved it wasn't their turn yet. Others wished him luck silently, knowing how it felt to be nervous before a performance. The boy's steps were soft, almost too quiet for the wooden floor. He didn't try to look confident or pretend he wasn't nervous. He simply walked with the calmness of someone who had made peace with whatever might happen next. His hands were slightly cold, but his eyes stayed fixed on the piano. The stage lights felt warm on his face as he approached the instrument. He paused for a moment, not to think or hesitate, but to absorb the silence of the hall. Everyone waited, unsure if this quiet teenager could make anything meaningful come from that tired-looking piano. The director leaned forward a little, his expression unreadable. Maybe he expected the boy to struggle. Maybe he expected another ordinary performance. Or maybe he just expected the piano to sound as dull as it looked. The boy reached the bench and gently pulled it closer. He sat down slowly, adjusting the height the way he had practiced many times before. Then he lifted his hands and let them hover above the keys for a moment. Everything was still. The hall that had been buzzing with whispers and nervous laughter earlier now felt frozen. No one wanted to blink, afraid they might miss the opening note. Some parents held their breath, while the performers backstage peeked from behind the curtains. The boy lowered his hands, and the first note he played broke the silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply pure, clean, warm, unexpected. A sound that didn't match the worn appearance of the piano at all. People in the audience straightened in their seats. Some looked at each other with surprise. The director blinked. He wasn't expecting that. The boy continued, letting the melody unfold gently. His fingers moved with control and confidence, as if he knew each key personally. The sound drifted across the hall, filling every corner with something soft yet strong. And with every passing second, more people leaned in to listen. It felt like the hall breathed differently now. The tension that had hung in the air slowly faded, replaced with the curiosity of something extraordinary happening right in front of them. The director placed his coffee cup down, for the first time since he entered the hall. He looked genuinely interested, and all the boy had done so far was play the first few notes. The hall was so quiet that the soft hum of the ceiling lights suddenly felt loud. Even backstage, the performers who had been whispering earlier now stood still, their eyes focused on the small gap in the curtains. No one had expected the quiet boy to create such a sound from an old piano that looked like it had survived decades of neglect. But there he was, sitting calmly, his fingers moving with the kind of confidence that came from years of private practice rather than public praise. The director, who just moments earlier had mocked the piano, leaned back slightly in his chair. His arms, once crossed tightly across his chest, slowly loosened. His expression was not one of amusement anymore. Instead, it was closer to curiosity, a curiosity he rarely displayed so early in a performance. He studied the boy more intently, as if he was trying to understand how someone so quiet could produce something so moving. The boy continued to play, completely unaware of the shift happening in the audience. His eyes stayed focused on the keys, not because he feared making a mistake, but because the music demanded his full attention. He wasn't performing to impress the director or anyone else. He played because he loved the way the music flowed from his hands, how each note seemed to breathe on its own. The old piano responded to him, as if it had been waiting for someone who knew exactly how to touch its keys. A few people in the audience leaned forward, careful not to make noise. Some held their hands clasped together, mesmerized by the softness and depth of the sound. Even the usual coughs and shuffles that filled public spaces seemed to disappear. The hall felt suspended in a moment that didn't want to end. The director's assistant, who sat 2 seats away, glanced at him with slight surprise. She had worked with him long enough to recognize the small changes in his face. The director wasn't easy to impress, especially not by young performers. He had judged hundreds of competitions, and his standards were famously high. But the way he listened now showed something different. It was subtle, but it was there. Backstage, a girl who was scheduled to perform after the boy whispered to another performer, "Where did that come from?" She wasn't jealous, just amazed. They all knew the piano wasn't in its best shape. Everyone had played it at least once during rehearsals. It had stiff keys, a few strings that buzzed, and a pedal that sometimes stuck. But in the boy's hands, it sounded almost elegant. As the boy reached the middle of his piece, the melody shifted. It became bolder, fuller, rising and falling like a calm wave. The audience followed the movement, some unknowingly swaying slightly with the rhythm. The old piano responded with a clarity that felt impossible for its condition. Yet, every note came through, as if the instrument had decided to give its best just for him. The director rested his chin on his hand, studying the boy's posture, the shape of his hands, the delicate control of his fingers. He couldn't deny the truth anymore. This wasn't luck. This was skill. Real skill. The kind that couldn't be taught in a few lessons or picked up casually. This was years of dedication quietly hidden in a small-town teenager who didn't seem to realize what he was doing to the room. The boy's breathing matched the music, steady, gentle, controlled. He didn't rush. He didn't try to show off. He let the piece unfold naturally. The sound filled every corner of the hall, reaching even the people who usually struggled to stay focused during long performances. No one looked away. No one checked their phones. The moment had captured all of them. For a brief second, the director closed his eyes to listen more deeply. When he opened them again, his expression was different from earlier. There was no trace of the mockery he had shown when he first saw the piano. Instead, there was a mixture of surprise, respect, and something else, something like regret. He realized he had judged too quickly. The boy continued playing, his fingers dancing over the keys with a kind of freedom that came from years of quiet practice at home. He remembered mornings when he would wake up early, long before school, just to sit at the piano while the rest of the house slept. He remembered nights when everyone was tired, but he stayed up a little longer, playing softly so he wouldn't wake anyone. Music had always been the part of the day that felt like his dot now, in front of a full hall. He played with the same private passion he had always carried. The director watched him closely, noticing something most people wouldn't. The boy's hands had small marks on them, the kind that came from tightening screws, sanding wood, lifting pieces of metal. They were not the smooth hands of someone who only practiced indoors. They were hands that worked, hands that fixed things, hands that built things. The director lifted his head slightly, realizing something he hadn't considered earlier. This boy didn't just play the piano. Understood it. He reached the final section of the piece. The melody softened again, returning to the gentle tone that had first captured the room. His fingers slowed slightly as the notes carried deeper emotion. The boy wasn't trying to end with dramatic flair. Instead, he wanted the music to fade naturally, like a quiet breath at the end of a long story. The audience listened carefully. Some felt their eyes sting, moved in a way they hadn't expected at a local youth event. A few parents who normally came only to support their kids now felt something personal in the music. Even the children in the back rows, who often got restless during long performances, sat unusually still as the final notes approached. The boy let the sound linger in the air for a moment before gently lifting his hands from the keys. The last vibration from the piano drifted through the hall and faded into silence. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. Then the applause broke out. It wasn't rushed or polite. It was real. It was loud. It filled the hall with the same energy the music had created minutes earlier. People stood up, clapping with genuine excitement, surprised by what they had witnessed. The boy looked up only then, slightly startled by the reaction. He wasn't used to applause like this. He gave a small, shy smile, unsure of what to do with the sudden attention. The director didn't clap at first, not because he didn't want to, but because he was too busy processing everything he had just seen. Finally, after a moment, he joined in. His applause was slow at first, but then it grew stronger. He even stood from his seat, something he rarely did for young performers. The event coordinator stepped onto the stage again, her face lit with excitement. She hadn't expected the showcase to begin with such a powerful moment. She thanked the boy for his performance, but her voice trembled slightly with emotion. The boy stood, nodded politely, and stepped off the stage. As he walked toward the backstage area, some performers reached out to pat his shoulder or whisper compliments. He appreciated it, but he didn't dwell on praise. All he cared about was that he had played honestly. When he stepped backstage, he let out a quiet breath he had been holding for minutes. Meanwhile, the director was still standing, his eyes following the boy as he disappeared behind the curtain. He had more questions now than answers. Something about the performance didn't match what he had expected, especially the sound of that old piano. He glanced at the instrument again. How had something so worn out produced something so pure? Maybe the piano wasn't the problem. Maybe he had been the one who underestimated it. He slowly sat back down, his expression serious but thoughtful. The audience continued to buzz, still discussing the performance in excited whispers. The director knew one thing for certain. He had witnessed something rare, and he wanted to know more. The applause from the boy's performance had barely faded when the next performer stepped onto the stage, but the energy in the room was still charged with what everyone had just witnessed. People continued whispering about the unexpected brilliance that had come from the old piano, their voices filled with excitement and disbelief. But while the audience was still talking among themselves, the boy stood backstage, leaning lightly against the wall as he tried to slow his breathing. He wasn't out of breath because the piece was difficult. It wasn't the playing itself that made his chest feel tight. It was everything else, the stares from the audience, the director's sudden interest, the applause that had felt like a wave rushing toward him. He had played the piano his whole life, but he wasn't used to attention. He wasn't used to eyes following him as if he had done something extraordinary. He liked music because it allowed him to feel calm. It allowed him to express things he didn't know how to say aloud. But today felt different. Today, his music had escaped the quiet corners of his home and filled a room full of people. And for the first time, people had actually listened. A few performers approached him, smiling wide. That was amazing. One of them said softly, "I didn't know the piano could sound like that." Another added, The boy simply nodded and gave a shy smile. He wasn't the type to brag or make a big show of things. Their words meant something to him, but he didn't know how to respond properly. Compliments always made him nervous. They made him feel like he had to reply in a way that matched their excitement, but his nature was quieter as the showcase continued on stage. The director couldn't keep his attention steady. The performers who came after the boy were trying their best, and some played quite well, but his mind kept drifting back to the performance he had just heard. He kept replaying the sound in his head, wondering how such a tone could come from that old instrument. Every now and then, he glanced at the piano again. At first, he thought he must have imagined the richness of the sound. But no, the memory of it was far too vivid. There was something special in the way the boy played, something that couldn't be ignored, that the director tapped his fingers on his knee, a habit he had whenever he was deep in thought. He had heard hundreds of young musicians over the years, but only a few had ever caught his attention like this. Something about this boy felt different, unpolished but honest, untrained but deeply skilled, quiet but powerful in the way he played. Meanwhile, backstage, the boy walked away from the crowd of performers and found a small corner where he could sit alone. He didn't want to be rude, but he needed a moment to himself. His mind was still buzzing with the intensity of everything that had happened. He replayed the moment he stepped on stage, the way the piano felt under his fingers, the sudden silence of the crowd. He remembered seeing the director in the corner of his eye, leaning forward as if trying to catch every note. At first, he thought it was a mistake, that maybe he was imagining the attention. But no, the director had definitely been watching closely. For most kids, being noticed by a famous director would be a dream. But for him, it felt heavy, like something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Across the hall, the director finally leaned over to his assistant. "What's his name?" he asked quietly. His assistant blinked, surprised. "Which one?" "The boy who played earlier," he said, keeping his voice low. She checked the list on her clipboard. "He's listed in the 4th slot. I can find him for you later if you want to speak with him." The director didn't respond right away. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if confirming something internally. He wasn't sure exactly what he wanted to say to the boy yet, but he knew he needed to talk to him. Something about that performance had struck him deeper than he was prepared to admit publicly. The performances continued on stage, but the audience wasn't as focused as before. It wasn't the fault of the next performers. They were doing their best. But the atmosphere had shifted. The bar had been raised unexpectedly, and everyone felt it. One performer even stumbled slightly during their piece, distracted by the lingering memory of the boy's performance. The pressure had become heavier for all of them. After several more performances, there was a short break. People stood up from their seats, stretching their legs and talking excitedly. Many parents approached the event coordinator to compliment the showcase, praising the talent on stage. But nearly every conversation eventually circled back to the same thing. That boy earlier, who was he? How did he make that old piano sound so beautiful? I've been to many school events, but I've never heard anything like that. The event coordinator felt both proud and slightly overwhelmed. She had known the boy for years. She had seen him around town, often quiet, rarely drawing attention. She knew he helped his father with repairs in their small workshop. She also knew he practiced whenever he had free time. But she had never seen him perform with such confidence. She walked backstage to check on the performers and found him sitting alone on a wooden bench. His head lowered, his hands resting on his knees. "You okay?" she asked gently. He looked up and nodded. "Yes, just resting." "You played beautifully," she said. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Thank you." "You know, the director was very impressed," she added. The boy's shoulders stiffened slightly. "He was?" She nodded. "He asked about you." He didn't know how to feel about that. Part of him felt honored, but another part felt nervous. He didn't want expectations placed on him. He didn't play music for attention or fame. He played because it made him feel alive in a way nothing else did. Back inside the hall, the director left his seat and walked closer to the stage during the break. He circled the piano slowly, examining it with a sharper eye. Up close, the flaws were even more visible scratches, dense, uneven corners, and keys that had lost their shine long ago. He pressed one key lightly. The sound was dull. He pressed another, still dull. He frowned. That wasn't the sound he had heard earlier. It didn't make sense. He pressed a few more keys. The piano sounded uneven, some keys too light, some too heavy. Nothing like the clear, rich tones he remembered. His assistant approached him. "Something wrong?" "This piano didn't sound like this earlier," he muttered. "It's an old piano," she reminded him. "Maybe it just depends on the player." He didn't respond. His mind was racing. He had worked with musicians his whole life. He knew that a skilled performer could bring out the best in an instrument, but not to this extent. The difference was too dramatic. He stepped away from the piano, deep in thought. As the break ended, the event coordinators urged the audience to return to their seats. The second half of the showcase began, filled with singers, violinists, and small group performances. They were all talented in their own way, but the earlier performance still hovered in the background like a shadow. The boy sat backstage, watching the performances quietly. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He wasn't thinking about the director either. His mind wandered to something else entirely. He started remembering days spent in his father's workshop. The smell of sawdust mixed with metal. The sound of tools tapping, scraping, adjusting. His father's calm voice, teaching him how to listen not with ears alone, but with patience. He remembered taking apart old parts of instruments, cleaning them, shaping them, polishing them. He remembered the small victories when something broken finally worked again. And he remembered the piano, the old, worn-out piano the town had almost thrown away. He had worked on it quietly for months. Every evening, after helping his father in the shop, he would walk to the art center and sit with the piano. Some days he tightened screws. Other days he cleaned the strings. Some days he just touched the keys and listened. He had rebuilt parts of it by hand, piece by piece, using whatever leftover materials he could find. No one had asked him to do it. No one even knew. He did it because he believed the piano still had music inside it. Back in the hall, the director looked at him again from afar as another performer bowed on stage. He wasn't looking at him the way a judge looked at a contestant. There was something else in his expression. Now, a curiosity mixed with respect. As the final performance of the day approached, the atmosphere in the hall settled again. The event coordinator explained that after the last performance, the judges would share their thoughts and choose the standout performances. The boy listened quietly, not expecting anything. He didn't think of himself as someone who would win an award. He played because he loved the piano. Nothing more. But the director had a different plan forming in his mind. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who the boy really was. He wanted to understand how a quiet teenager had managed to shake an entire room with a single performance. Showcase wasn't over yet, and neither was the story. That had just begun. The morning after the rehearsal felt different, almost like the air itself carried a strange mix of tension and quiet expectation. The studio wasn't fully awake yet, but the hallways already buzzed with whispers from crew members who had stayed late the night before. Word had spread quickly about what happened on the soundstage the moment when the quiet young player shut down every smirk and shocked even the most stubborn people in the room. Some walked around pretending they weren't impressed, but their voices told a different story. Every whisper carried curiosity, some carried excitement, and a few carried envy. When he arrived at the doors of the building, he tried to tell himself to stay calm. He didn't know if anyone would treat him differently today. Part of him didn't want the attention at all. He just wanted to play, nothing more. But deep down, he also knew that yesterday had changed something. He wasn't sure what, and he wasn't sure whether that change was good or bad. A security guard who never looked up from his phone greeted him with a respectful nod this time. It was subtle, a tiny shift, but the kind of shift that told him the world inside the building had already begun rearranging itself. He nodded back with a small smile and walked inside. His hands felt slightly cold, but his mind was sharper than usual. When he reached the rehearsal room, he paused at the door. He could hear soft chatter inside. He heard his name well, not his name exactly, but things like the kid from yesterday and the one who shut everyone up. He didn't want to enter and interrupt anything, but he also knew he couldn't just stand there like a stranger. He stepped in. A handful of musicians froze mid-conversation. A few looked away quickly, pretending they hadn't been talking about him. Others smiled at him politely. There was no mocking grin today, no condescending looks. He wasn't sure if that made him feel more comfortable or more nervous. One of the older musicians waved him over. "Good to see you," he said with a warm, fatherly voice. "You really shook the walls yesterday. Haven't heard the director stay quiet for that long in years." He laughed softly, even though he felt shy. "I wasn't trying to shake anything. I just used the piano they gave me." "Exactly," the older musician replied with a smile. "That's what made it good?" He set down his bag and sat on the small stool near the corner. Part of him expected the director to burst in with that same loud tone from the day before, ready to dismiss him again or act like nothing happened. But instead of anticipating trouble, he chose to breathe slowly. Today needed a steady mind. Minutes passed. Musicians tuned their instruments. Assistants arranged cameras. Someone tested the microphone levels. The usual noise of a production morning filled the room busy. Lively, slightly chaotic. At last, the director walked in. His steps were firm, but not as aggressive as yesterday. His face carried a hard expression, but it wasn't full of mockery this time. It was more like someone who had been up late thinking about something he didn't want to admit. He scanned the room, nodded at a few people, and finally let his eyes land on the young player. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No words passed between them, but there was an invisible conversation happening, and the young player understood it clearly. The director hadn't forgotten what he heard yesterday. The music had struck him harder than he expected. The director cleared his throat and said, "All right, everyone. We're running through the scene again. Let's stay focused." He tried to sound unaffected, but a few people in the room exchanged small smiles. They saw the change too. The young player waited for the director to call him directly. He expected some strict instruction, or perhaps a reminder to stay simple, or don't show off. But the director avoided addressing him at all. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Finally, one of the assistants stepped closer to the young player and said, "He wants you on set." Same piano, same scene. "All right," he answered softly. When he approached the piano, he gently rested his fingers on the edge. He hadn't expected to face this same moment again so soon, but he welcomed it. This time, the pressure felt different. Yesterday, he had felt like someone fighting just to be heard. Today, he felt like someone with something worth hearing. The director walked over at last. His posture stiffened as he stopped beside the piano. "We'll start with the emotional part first," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Don't overdo it, just play it in the way you think fits the scene." The "don't overdo it" wasn't surprising. But "play it in the way you think fits the scene" definitely was. He nodded slowly. "I can do that." The director seemed unsure how to respond, so he simply stepped back. Everyone moved into position. Cameras rolled. Lights warmed the air. Silence settled in. He placed his hands on the keys. The first touch felt fragile, but only for a second. He let his fingers glide gently, starting with a soft melody that carried the weight of patience, calmness, and a quiet sort of longing. The notes weren't loud, but they filled the room in a warm, deep way. Some of the actors on set, who had been preparing for their lines, turned slightly toward the sound. The melody flowed through the space, cutting through the lights and wires and machinery. Even the crew members who never paid attention to rehearsals looked up. The director, despite trying to maintain a tough expression, leaned forward ever so slightly. He played with emotion, not dramatic emotion, not exaggerated emotion, but a sincere feeling that came from a place he didn't always share. Each key carried a piece of something personal. He didn't think about impressing anyone. He didn't think about proving anything. He just played his truth. Minutes passed. The director raised his hand slowly to pause the scene. "That's enough for now," he said. But his voice wasn't sharp or impatient. It was careful. Almost gentle. The young player lifted his fingers and sat quietly, unsure what reaction to expect. The director stepped closer again. "Do it again," he said. Exactly the same way. There were no insults, no mocking tone, no dismissive smirk. He simply wanted to hear it again. The second run felt even more natural. The notes carried more confidence, as if the piano itself understood him now. The room stayed unusually still. No movement, no whispered comments, no side conversations. Just listening. When he finished, the director stood quietly for several seconds. His usual quick, sharp remarks never arrived. Instead, he said something no one expected to hear from him. "Good." That was. "Good." A few crew members exchanged glances. Some even looked shocked that the young player didn't respond. He didn't want to break the delicate moment. The director looked down briefly, almost embarrassed. "We'll use that. It fits the scene well." Then he walked away, but the room didn't move right away. Everyone kept watching the young player. Not in the way people stare at someone who made a mistake or someone they underestimate. This was different. It was the look people give when they've just witnessed something real. He finally stood up from the piano, unsure where to place his hands or how to behave. An assistant came over with a small smile, offering him a cup of water. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "You made a lot of people quiet today." He gave a shy laugh. "I wasn't trying to make anyone quiet. That's what makes it better," she replied. The day continued with several more rehearsals, though none held the same weight as the first two. By the afternoon, the young player felt clearer than he had in a long time. He realized something important, something he hadn't told anyone yet. Playing the piano here wasn't just about being part of the project. It wasn't even about earning respect from the director or proving himself to anyone. It was about something deeper, something that had lived in him since he was small. He played because music was the only place where he felt completely understood. When the last rehearsal ended, people lingered around him again. Some patted him on the shoulder. Some complimented his playing. Others simply smiled at him as they passed. He had walked into this building as a background musician, someone easily overlooked. But now, the room treated him differently, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it without saying a single unnecessary word. When he stepped outside into the cooler evening air, he felt lighter. The day had been long, but something inside him felt calm and steady. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The director was unpredictable. The production schedule was intense. And there were many challenges ahead. But for the first time since he entered this place, he felt like he belonged. And the story that started with a mocking comment, "You call that a piano?" was slowly turning into something far bigger than he ever imagined. The boy left the rehearsal room with slow steps, still trying to understand why the director had spoken to him with such interest. He wasn't used to adults asking about his life, especially people from big cities who carried themselves with authority. The conversation replayed in his mind again and again, each detail making him more unsure of what the director truly wanted. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to drop, leaving warm light drifting across the school courtyard. A soft breeze brushed past him, calming his thoughts. He walked toward the old bike he always used to get home, his fingers brushing over the handlebars as he tried to ease the tension from his chest. He didn't tell anyone about the conversation, not his family, not the performers, not even the stage crew who had been curious about his earlier success. He preferred keeping things quiet until they were clear in his own mind. And right now, nothing felt clear. While he rode home, the world around him looked strangely normal compared to the excitement at the hall. Kids played near the small shops. An old man watered his plants. A woman folded clothes outside her house. Everything was peaceful, almost too peaceful for a day that had stirred so many thoughts inside him. When he reached home, the house stood still like it always did. It was simple small walls, warm windows, and a roof that needed repairs every year. But it was warm in a way that made him feel grounded. He parked his bike and walked inside. His mother was kneeling on the floor, sorting vegetables for dinner. She looked up with a smile that carried love and tiredness at the same time. "You're home early," she said softly. He nodded. "The event finished for the day. I'll have to go again tomorrow." She nodded without asking more. She trusted him. She always had. He washed his hands and sat down at the old table, helping her peel the vegetables. They worked quietly together, comfortable in the silence. Every now and then she glanced at him, noticing the distant look in his eyes. "Something on your mind?" she finally asked. He shrugged lightly. It was a busy day. She didn't push further. She knew her son spoke when he was ready. That night, after dinner, he sat at the piano in the corner of the living room. Their piano wasn't perfect either, but it was better than the one at the hall. It had been his grandfather's before it was passed down. The wood was scratched, and some keys had faded edges, but it was the heart of the home. He placed his fingers on the keys and played softly. The sound filled the room, warm and familiar. His mother listened from the kitchen, smiling. His younger brother scribbled something on a notebook, while humming along without even realizing. The boy's thoughts wandered as he played. He wondered if the director would attend again tomorrow. He wondered if the man had genuine respect for him, or if he simply saw potential to shape into something else. He wondered if something big was quietly unfolding around him. Before sleeping that night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the piano, the hall, the director, the attention, the applause, and the sudden shift in how everyone saw him. Never before had he been the center of anything. And now he didn't know whether to feel proud or scared. The next morning came faster than he expected. He dressed simply, grabbed his bag, and left his house early. The roads were still quiet, filled with the faint morning chill. When he arrived at the event hall, a few people were already inside, preparing equipment. The stage crew greeted him warmly, and some performers waved at him with renewed respect. He nodded politely, slipping through them without drawing unnecessary attention as he stepped into the hall. He saw the director sitting again, this time closer to the piano. The man held a notebook in his lap, his expression focused. The boy hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach. But the director looked up and gave a small nod. "Good morning," he said. The boy bowed politely. "Good morning." The director tapped his pen thoughtfully against the notebook. "I've been thinking about your performance yesterday. It wasn't just skill. It was something deeper, something rare. The boy didn't know what to say. Compliments always made him uncomfortable. "I want to hear you play again," the director continued, gesturing to the piano. Some performers watched from a distance, whispering quietly but respectfully. They knew something important was happening, but none dared interrupt. The boy moved toward the piano. He sat down slowly, adjusting the seat. His fingers brushed the keys, testing them gently. The old instrument felt the same tired, yet waiting. He took a small breath and began playing a different piece this time. The notes flowed smoothly at first, then grew more expressive. The director leaned forward slightly, paying close attention to every detail. The boy's control, his transitions, his subtle changes in tempo, the emotion behind the notes. When the boy finished, silence followed again. The director finally spoke. "You understand music in a way that can't be taught quickly. You've grown with it. You live with it. That's why it sounds so honest." The boy lowered his gaze, unsure how to respond. "Do you know what you're capable of?" the director asked. He shook his head slowly. Most young performers try to impress. They show off. They rush. They want to shine. But you tell a story. That's something professionals spend years learning. The boy listened quietly, absorbing every word. The director closed his notebook. "I want to guide you, if you're open to it. Not to change you, but to help you grow. You have something rare, and I don't want it to go unnoticed." The boy's heartbeat quickened. He didn't know what to say, what to agree to, or even what it all meant. Part of him felt excitement, but a larger part felt fear of stepping into something unknown. "I don't want you to answer right away," the director said gently. "Think about it. Talk to your family. This isn't a small decision." The boy nodded slowly. Just then, the event coordinator entered the hall, calling everyone to gather for the next round of performances. The director stepped back, allowing the boy to rejoin the group. Throughout the performances, the boy sat in his usual quiet corner, but his thoughts were far from quiet. Every moment, he kept replaying the director's words. During a break, a few performers approached him. "You played again this morning?" one girl asked. He nodded. "Did he say anything?" Another whispered. He hesitated. "He wants to help me, maybe. I'm not sure." Their eyes widened slightly. Not with jealousy, more with amazement. When the event resumed, the boy stayed focused, watching others perform with renewed attention. He could now see what the director meant. Some performers tried too hard. Others played correctly, but without emotion. A few had talent, but not many showed the quiet honesty the director kept talking about. Hours passed, and by the time evening arrived, the hall was filled with chatter again. Families entered to watch the final run-throughs. Children pointed toward the stage, and parents whispered excitedly about the upcoming show. As the boy prepared to leave for the day, the director approached one last time. "Remember," he said softly, "think about what we discussed. Great opportunities come quietly. You just have to be ready to hear them." The boy nodded again, uncertain but thoughtful. The walk home felt longer that evening. The sky was painted with fading colors, and the air held the coolness of approaching night. He thought about music, about his life, about what change might mean. When he reached home, his mother sensed instantly that something important had happened. "You look thoughtful," she said gently. He sat down beside her and took a slow breath. "Someone wants to help me," he said quietly. "Someone who knows music well." Her hands paused mid-motion. "Is this a good person?" "I think so," he whispered. She nodded, her eyes soft but cautious. "We will talk about it together. You don't have to decide alone." For the first time that day, he felt a little lighter. Later that night, he played again at the family piano, pouring every uncertain feeling into the notes. His mother listened, understanding more through the music than through words. The boy didn't know what the future held, but he felt something shifting, something slowly unfolding around him. And he sensed deep in his heart that tomorrow might bring even more changes. It was still early in the morning when the light outside the window quietly shifted, slipping through the curtains and settling across the room. The air felt calm, almost too calm for a day that carried so much weight. Everyone in the house sensed that something important was about to happen, though no one said it out loud. It had been a long journey full of moments that had shaken them, tested them, and changed them in ways they never expected. Now, as the final chapter of their experience approached, each person prepared in their own way, quietly collecting their thoughts. Downstairs, the familiar hum of the kettle filled the kitchen. It was a soft, steady sound that had become a comforting part of their mornings, something that made the house feel warm, even during uncertain times. One of them reached for cups, setting them carefully on the counter, their hands trembling slightly. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a mixture of anticipation and hope tangled together. They knew what today meant. They knew it wasn't just another step forward. It was the step, the one that would show whether everything they had faced had truly led them to something better. As they sat together at the table, the mood was quiet but supportive. No one needed to fill the air with unnecessary words. Sometimes silence carries its own kind of understanding. They exchanged small smiles, gentle nods, little gestures that reminded each other that they weren't alone. Even without long speeches or dramatic moments, the bond they shared felt stronger than ever. By the time they stepped outside, the sun had finally settled into the sky, warming the path ahead of them. The day felt fresh, like something was beginning rather than ending. Birds moved between branches, their soft calls drifting through the air. Everything around them seemed to echo the same message. Keep going. The walk felt longer than usual, maybe because their thoughts were heavier. But with each step, the tension slowly eased. They talked about small things at first, simple conversations, to keep their minds from spiraling into worry. Then, gradually, they opened up about what the past weeks had meant, how the challenges had pushed them to reconsider their views, their fears, even their sense of what was possible. One of them spoke quietly about the moment they almost gave up, how it was only the support from the others that helped them keep going. Another shared how they had discovered a strength they didn't know they had. Every confession felt honest, raw, and real. No one tried to sound perfect. They spoke like people who had lived through something meaningful and didn't want to hide it. When they reached the building, they paused for a moment outside the doors. The place felt bigger than they remembered, maybe because they knew what waited inside. The entrance was busy, with people flowing in and out, each carrying their own stories, their own reasons for being there. But for them, this moment was personal. They took a deep breath together before stepping inside. The hallway was quiet compared to the outside. The soft footsteps, the muted voices in the distance, the faint echo of doors closing it, all created a strange mix of calmness and anticipation. They checked in, completed the formalities, and waited on a long bench near the window. Sunlight stretched across the floor, creating shifting patterns that they watched without really thinking about it. Finally, their names were called. The room they entered felt familiar, yet new. They had been here before, but something about it carried a different energy today. Maybe it was because this time, they weren't entering with fear, they were entering with purpose. The conversation that followed wasn't rushed. It didn't feel like an interrogation or a challenge. Instead, it felt like a final reflection, an opportunity to show everything they had learned, everything they understood now. They answered questions calmly, honestly, without trying to exaggerate or hide anything. For the first time in a long time, they felt confident in their own truth. As the discussion continued, they realized something important. The journey had changed them far more than the destination ever could. They had walked through uncertainty, frustration, and doubt, yet they kept going. They had grown, not because they wanted recognition, but because life had led them through experiences that forced them to look inward. When the final words were spoken and the decision was shared, the room seemed to exhale with them. Relief washed over their faces, soft and overwhelming. They didn't cheer loudly or jump up in excitement. They simply breathed. A long, deep breath that carried weeks of tension out of their bodies. They thanked everyone politely before stepping back into the hallway. The sunlight felt different, now brighter, warmer, like the world outside had been waiting to welcome them into something new. They walked out of the building with lighter steps, each one carrying a quiet sense of victory. On the way home, the mood was completely different from the morning. They laughed more, talked more freely, and allowed themselves to feel happy without holding back. Every little thing, from the breeze brushing past them to the sound of distant traffic, felt meaningful. They knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was the start of a new chapter. Back at home, they sat together again, this time with a sense of ease. The worry that once lingered in every corner of the room was gone. Instead, there was warmth, real, heartfelt warmth that came from knowing they had made it through something difficult together. They talked late into the afternoon, remembering the earlier challenges and the small victories along the way. They spoke about how every moment, even the uncomfortable ones, had shaped them in ways they never expected. They realized that the struggles had taught them patience, courage, and a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. By evening, the sky outside turned soft shades of orange and pink. The colors stretched across the horizon like a quiet celebration. They stepped outside for a moment, looking up at the sky as the day slowly faded. None of them said anything, but they didn't need to. The silence felt full of gratitude, full of relief, full of the hope that comes after surviving a long, uncertain climb. As the first stars began to appear, they went back inside, ending the day with a sense of peace they hadn't felt in a long time. They knew there would still be challenges in the future. Life never stays perfect for long, but they also knew they were stronger now. Stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. Their journey hadn't been flawless. It hadn't been smooth or easy, but it had been real. And sometimes, real is exactly what makes a story worth telling. The morning of the final rehearsal arrived quietly, without any rush or noise from the outside world. It felt like the calm before something important, the kind of calm that makes a person breathe slower and notice the softness of the air around them. When he stepped outside his house, the sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky in soft colors. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the cool morning breeze settle his thoughts. Today didn't feel like the other days. There was something different in the air, like a quiet turning point that he could sense but not fully understand. He picked up his bag and walked toward his bike, feeling the weight of the last few days resting gently on his shoulders. It wasn't a heavy weight, just one that reminded him how much his life had changed without him planning any of it. The ride to the hall felt smoother than usual. The streets were still empty, the world still stretching its arms awake. As he approached the building, he noticed a few people already moving inside. Their posture seemed sharper, more energized, like everyone knew that today mattered. When he entered the hall, he found the director sitting alone near the piano. The man was staring at the keys with an expression he hadn't seen before, something thoughtful, perhaps even respectful. The director looked up when he heard footsteps, then gave a small nod. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," the boy replied softly. The director closed his notebook, letting it rest on his lap. "I want to talk to you before everyone else arrives." The boy froze for a moment, unsure what the man wanted. But he nodded, then stepped closer. "I've been in this field a long time," the director began. His voice was calm, not sharp like before. "I've worked with professionals from all over the world. Some are full of passion. Some are full of confidence. Some pretend to know more than they do. And some have something deep inside them, something they don't even realize they have." The boy listened quietly, his hands tightening around the straps of his bag. "You," the director continued, "have that something. It's not just skill. It's not just emotion. It's a rare honesty in your music. It makes people stop. It makes them listen." The boy looked down, unsure what to say. "And because of that," the director said slowly, carefully, "I want you to be part of the final performance. Not in the background. Not on the side. I want you in the center." The boy's heart skipped a beat. "Center?" he repeated softly. The director nodded. "Yes, the main piece. The spotlight will be on you." For a moment, the boy forgot how to breathe. He stood still, almost frozen, the words echoing in his head. He had never imagined being at the center of anything. He had always been the quiet one, the boy who played because the piano felt like home. He had never chased a spotlight. He never even dreamed of being chosen. "You don't have to decide right now," the director said. "Think about it. But if you say yes, I'll guide you through every part of the performance. You won't be alone." The boy tried to speak, but his voice failed him. So he simply nodded. "Good, the D.